the silent heat of the Arabian desert, a single shout echoes across the dunes, followed by the clash of steel, the thunder of galloping horses, and clouds of dust rising like smoke from a burning land. One wounded warrior collapses, and instantly a vow is made. His blood will be avenged, no matter the cost. This was the reality of Arabia before the rise of Islam. A world where honor was everything, and revenge was a duty passed down from father to son. One insult, one accidental killing, even one broken agreement could ignite a war that lasted not days, not months, but generations. Entire tribes burned in the fire of feuds they never started, and children were raised knowing they would someday fight a war they did not choose. In a land without kings, without courts, and without a central authority, justice was personal, delivered by the sword, fueled by pride, and written into the very identity of the tribe. To understand the Arabia in which the Prophet Muhammad would eventually emerge, we must first step into this world of constant tension, where the desert was both home and battlefield. The tribes of Arabia lived in isolation, yet were bound together by a delicate web of alliances, rivalries, and ancient grudges. Every well, every trade route, every poet's verse, and every act of bravery or humiliation shaped the fragile peace between them. The smallest spark could set off a chain of events that dragged entire families and clans into endless cycles of vengeance. This was the age when courage was measured by one's willingness to spill blood for honor, and loyalty meant standing with your tribe even if they were wrong. It was a society rich in courage, poetry, and hospitality, but equally rich in pride, ego, and unrestrained violence. And yet, beneath the chaos, something subtle was happening. Exhaustion was creeping into the hearts of the people. The weight of endless wars, the funerals of sons, the loss of livelihood, and the constant fear of retaliation had pushed Arabia to a breaking point. The people were searching for stability, craving justice, and longing for a way out of the darkness they had created. What they did not know was that these storms of blood and revenge were preparing the land for a transformation unlike anything they could imagine. For in this harsh, divided world, a new chapter was about to begin, one that would change the fate of Arabia forever. Why tribal wars started. To understand why tribal wars became the heartbeat of pre-Islamic Arabia, we must enter a land where survival itself was a daily negotiation with the desert. Life in Arabia was not supported by lush rivers or abundant fields, but by scattered wells, harsh mountains, and endless dunes. Every drop of water, every patch of grazing land, and every caravan route carried immense value. In a landscape so unforgiving, scarcity created tension, and tension created conflict. It wasn't always hatred that sparked tribal wars. Sometimes it was desperation, sometimes it was pride, and sometimes it was nothing more than a misunderstanding heavy enough to tip the delicate balance of peace. In Arabia, the question was never if conflict would erupt. It was when and between whom and for how long the flames would burn. At the core of Arabian society was the tribe. The tribe was identity, protection, justice, and family all woven into one. Without a tribe, a person was nothing. With a tribe, they became part of an unbreakable chain of lineage stretching back generations. This system created strength but also deep vulnerability. When honor was attached to blood, an injury to one member became an injury to all. If a man was insulted, the entire tribe felt the sting. If a man was killed, the tribe inherited the burden of vengeance. The concept was simple but lethal. Honor must be restored no matter the cost. Because of this, the smallest incident, a spilled water supply, a broken treaty, an argument over a camel, even a verse of mocking poetry, could escalate into battles spanning decades. Water was one of the most frequent triggers. Wells were lifelines, the beating heart of each tribe's survival. When one tribe encroached upon another's water source, even unintentionally, tensions rose immediately. A thirsty camel wandering to the wrong well, a shepherd accidentally crossing tribal boundaries, or a caravan blocking a water path could spark furious arguments. To an outsider, these events might seem trivial, but in a land where dehydration could kill faster than a sword, water was worth defending with blood. Many of the early feuds began at wells, and many ended because tribes no longer had the strength to keep fighting. Around these precious water sources, alliances were formed, betrayals unfolded, and blood was spilled more frequently than dates were harvested. Trade disputes created another layer of conflict. Arabia's position between the Roman and Persian empires turned desert tribes into essential links in long-distance commerce. Caravans carried spices, textiles, incense, leather, and precious metals. Each tribe wanted control over the trade routes that passed through their land, for they brought wealth, influence, and respect. But controlling a route meant challenging rival tribes. Theft of goods, attacks on caravans, disputes over tolls, and accusations of unfair trade practices were common sparks for animosity. Sometimes a caravan was robbed, and the tribe accused of it denied involvement, claiming innocence, while the aggrieved tribe demanded compensation. Suspicion alone was often enough to rupture peace. A single caravan raid could trigger a chain reaction that spiraled into war, especially if it involved the death of a merchant or the humiliation of a tribal leader. But perhaps the most surprising cause of conflict was poetry. The Arabs were masters of language, and the poet held immense power. A skilled poet could elevate a tribe's honor or destroy it with a single verse. Mocking poetry, satire, could become a weapon sharper than any blade. If a poet insulted a rival tribe by calling their warriors weak, their women dishonored, or their lineage tainted, the attack was not taken lightly. Words carried the weight of truth in that world. The tribe criticized would demand retraction or prepare for war. This cultural phenomenon turned poets into both celebrities and dangerous liabilities. One careless performance at a market or festival could ignite a conflict involving hundreds of warriors. Poetry fueled pride and pride fueled war. Accidental killings played an equally devastating role. In the desert, caravans and herders often crossed paths without warning. A misunderstanding, a misjudged movement, or a defensive reaction could lead to an unintended death. Even if the killing was accidental, tribal law demanded compensation, or blood. If compensation was refused or deemed insufficient, the incident escalated. What began as a mistake became a matter of honor, and what was meant to be resolved with negotiation turned into a spiral of retaliatory attacks. Each side claimed righteousness. Each believed they had been wronged. The cycle continued until one side was too broken to continue. At the foundation of all this was the Arabian Code of Honor. The code was unwritten but deeply internalized. Protect your tribe, defend its reputation, avenge its losses, and never allow an enemy to walk away without consequence. Breaking these rules meant disgrace. For a man to ignore an insult was cowardice. For a tribe to avoid revenge was humiliation. This intense value system created unity within tribes but rivalry between them. The desert carved their character. Harsh, resilient, fiercely loyal, and unafraid of conflict. Each tribe saw itself as responsible for preserving its dignity. And when dignity was threatened, war was inevitable. These conflicts were not mere skirmishes. They reshaped lives. When war erupted, men left their homes for months or years. Women and children suffered from scarcity as resources shifted to battles. Trade halted, alliances shifted, and fear shadowed daily life. Young boys grew up hearing about feuds they were expected to continue. The elderly remembered wars they could not forget. What outsiders might see as senseless violence, the Arabs saw as necessary, because without honor there was no meaning to life, and without vengeance there was no honor. Yet this belief came with a heavy cost. Tribal wars drained strength, wealth, and stability. Over time, many tribes longed for a way out but felt trapped by tradition. And so, Arabia existed in a constant state of tension. Peace was fragile, temporary, and strategic, not emotional. If peace served the tribe, it was honored. If it threatened the tribe's pride, it was discarded. Leaders gathered in nightly councils, discussing alliances, anticipating threats, predicting attacks, and preparing their warriors. Women recited elegies for fallen sons even before a battle began because they knew war was inevitable. The desert winds carried both silence and uncertainty. Any shift could become a storm of bloodshed. By the time Islam was about to emerge, Arabia was a land drowning in feuds, exhausted from generations of conflict and yearning for something more meaningful than revenge. Unknown to them, these very conditions were preparing their hearts for unity, justice, and a higher moral code that would soon replace chaos with purpose and endless violence with divine guidance. The famous War of Dahis and Gabra. The story of tribal wars in Arabia cannot be told without pausing at one of its most iconic and dramatic feuds, the War of Dahis and Gabra. A conflict that began not with a murder, a theft, or a political betrayal, but with something as simple as a horse race. This war stands as a testament to how deeply honor ran through the veins of Arabian society, how pride could outweigh reason, and how a moment of perceived injustice could spiral into years of bloodshed. To understand the intensity of this era, you must imagine a world where a race between two horses became the spark that ignited a storm. The tribes at the center of this conflict were Abs and Dubyan, two powerful clans belonging to the larger Ghatafan confederation. They had a long history of competition, tension, and pride, but also cooperation when needed. Their warriors were renowned, their poets celebrated, and their lineage respected. Yet all it took was one event to turn this shared history into a battlefield. The story begins with two horses, Dahis, owned by the leader of Abs, Qais ibn Zuhair, and Gabra, owned by a man from Dubian. Horse racing was not just entertainment in Arabia. It was a sacred competition of honor, courage, and tribal prestige. A win meant glory, respect, and bragging rights. A loss stung deeply. Both tribes placed immense wagers on the race, with crowds gathering to witness the showdown. The atmosphere was charged with excitement. Warriors gathered. Poets prepared to celebrate whichever side emerged victorious, and the desert wind carried the tension like a whisper of future chaos. When the race began, Dahis quickly gained the lead. It seemed that Abs would win, and cheers rose from their side. But as Dahis neared a narrow passage in the terrain, men from Nubian allegedly hid in the shadows and startled the horse, causing it to fall behind. Gabra crossed the finish line first, and Dubian declared victory. Abs erupted with anger, accusing Dubian of cheating. Dubian denied the accusation and demanded their winnings. Voices grew louder, tempers flared, and within moments the air became thick with the scent of imminent violence. Qais ibn Zuhair refused to accept the outcome. Honor demanded truth, and truth demanded justice. When Dubian insisted on taking the prize, Qais responded with cold defiance. No tribe could allow itself to be mocked or cheated. It was better to die than to live with humiliation. Negotiations were attempted, but pride struck deeper than reason. Words turned to threats, and threats turned to blades. The situation spiraled out of control, and the first blows were struck. A single deceit had now become a matter of tribal dignity. Both tribes called their warriors, and soon the desert echoed with the sounds of clashing steel and war cries. The war of Dahis and Gabra had begun. What could have been resolved with truth and compensation transformed into a long, brutal conflict fueled by bitterness and pride. The early battles were swift and fierce. Warriors from Abs and Dubian met in open fields, on mountain slopes, and near wells both sides desperately needed. Victories shifted back and forth, with neither tribe willing to submit. The feud grew beyond the original incident. Every casualty demanded another act of revenge. Blood flowed like desert rain, brief but intense. Entire families were drawn into the cycle. Mothers urged their sons to fight for their tribe's honor. Poets composed verses that inflamed hearts and mocked rivals. With every line of poetry, the conflict deepened, spreading like a wildfire neither tribe could contain. As the war continued, alliances began to shift. Neutral tribes were forced to choose sides or risk being caught in the crossfire. Some sought peace and negotiation, but the bitterness between Abs and Dubian was too deep. Qais ibn Zuhair became a symbol of Abs's pride, unyielding, determined, and fueled by the memory of the injustice he believed had been inflicted upon his tribe. Dubian's leaders matched his intensity, convinced that they had been wrongfully accused. Neither side wanted to appear weak. Neither side wanted history to remember them as the tribe that fell first. Years passed, and the war began consuming more than just lives. It consumed livelihoods. Caravans avoided the region, knowing the desert routes were unsafe. Trade declined. Resources were strained. Young boys grew into warriors with the feud ingrained into their identities. The origins of the conflict faded in memory, replaced by stories of fallen heroes and battles fought for glory. Few remembered that it had all begun with a horse race. All they knew was that they were duty-bound to continue the fight. Yet even in the middle of war, cracks began to appear in the resolve of the tribes. Loss piled upon loss. Families were shattered. Fathers buried sons. Warriors left home and never returned. The weight of the conflict grew unbearable. Slowly, voices emerged calling for reconciliation. Poets began crafting verses encouraging peace instead of vengeance. Wise leaders realized that the cost had far outweighed the reason for the war. The people were tired. They were drained. The land itself seemed weary of absorbing so much blood. Eventually, negotiations resumed, not out of mutual respect but exhaustion. Both tribes had reached their limit. The elders, realizing the war had become senseless, urged their people to end it. Honor had been avenged countless times already, and still no peace had come. Finally, a fragile settlement was reached. Compensation was agreed upon, alliances were restored, and the two tribes laid down their weapons, not because they forgave, but because they could no longer continue. The War of Dahis and Gabra left scars that lasted for generations. It reshaped how tribes understood the consequences of pride. It became a story recited to warn future leaders about the dangers of letting ego outweigh wisdom. More than anything, it exposed the instability of a society driven by revenge. One minor injustice could unravel an entire region. By the time Islam arrived, this war and others like it had prepared the hearts of many Arabs for a different way of life. They had tasted the bitterness of endless conflict. They had seen the destruction caused by pride. The war that started with two horses racing across the desert ended by pushing Arabia one step closer to longing for peace, unity, and a moral code that rose above tribal ego. The Basis War. 40 years of destruction. As the blood feuds grew across the Arabian Peninsula, something deeper began to take shape beneath the surface. A culture where retaliation became a sacred duty and forgiveness was seen almost as a betrayal. In this environment, every tribe moved with a heightened sense of suspicion. Every caravan traveled with armed escorts, and every gathering of leaders carried the unspoken tension of ancient grudges waiting to ignite again. Tribal honor had transformed into a system of permanent vigilance, where one careless moment could lead to a cycle of violence lasting generations. People had become prisoners not of walls, but of memories. Stories of betrayal, battles, and fallen ancestors whispered from tent to tent, father to son, weaving a psychological trap that no tribe knew how to escape. This atmosphere shaped the personality of every child born into Arabia. A young boy would grow up hearing not tales of peace, but narratives of vengeance. He would learn to memorize his tribe as heroes not for their wisdom, but for the number of enemies they had slain. A young girl would grow up knowing that her marriage might end a conflict or reignite one, because alliances between tribes often depended on the strategic value of relationships. Even weddings became political tools. A single refusal, a single insult, or even a misinterpreted gesture could break alliances built over decades. In this world, emotional restraint was seen as weakness, and expressing mercy could be viewed as dishonoring the blood of the fallen. Another layer of complexity came from the poets, whose words held almost the power of weapons. Arabian poets were the broadcasters of their time, and tribes treated them as invaluable assets. A few lines of poetic insult from a rival poet could humiliate an entire tribe, pushing them into war even if they didn't want it. Poets could elevate a tribe to legendary status or reduce it to mockery with a single performance at the annual gatherings. Their verses kept old wounds alive, reciting past tragedies and turning personal pain into national memory. In a way, poetry became gasoline poured over already burning feuds, fueling the flames through storytelling and emotional provocation. As these narratives spread, the economy also began to suffer. Trade routes became dangerous, and caravans often had to negotiate safe passage through territories controlled by hostile tribes. A merchant could return home rich one month and be ambushed the next simply because a distant cousin had offended someone years ago. Markets in towns like Ukas, Du al-Majaz, and Souk al-Mushakkar flourished only during sacred months, 4 months of the year when fighting was temporarily forbidden. These months became a fragile oasis of peace in a desert of violence. People from rival tribes walked past each other calmly in these markets, yet their eyes still carried stories of blood. They were waiting, they were counting days, and everyone knew that the moment the sacred month ended, unresolved tensions would explode again. Even the religious aspect of the region was shaped by this cycle. The tribes believed they were protected by their idols, and each idol was tied to tribal identity. Insulting an idol meant insulting the tribe. Damaging an idol meant declaring war. The Kaaba itself, filled with hundreds of idols, stood ironically as a symbol of unity, yet served as a silent witness to the divisions tearing the land apart. People circled it in devotion, prayed for blessings, and then returned to a world where the slightest misunderstanding could trigger a massacre. All this collective tension created an environment where bravery was measured by a man's willingness to die, not his ability to preserve life. The more a tribe lost, the more determined it became to continue fighting, believing that giving up would erase its dignity forever. Eventually, the entire society reached a point where peace felt unnatural and conflict felt familiar. Honor had become a chain, tradition had become a weight, and the people of Arabia, without realizing it, were desperately waiting for a new kind of leadership, one that could break these chains, challenge these norms, and offer a path where justice meant more than revenge and unity meant more than temporary alliances. Effects of these wars on Arabia. But beneath all the chaos, something unexpected was forming in the shadows of Arabia, a slow, quiet shift in the hearts of people who were growing tired of generations of conflict. Even though tribal wars were common and retaliation was considered an obligation, many individuals from within those same tribes had begun to question the endless cycle. They were warriors by necessity, not by choice, and over time the constant loss of fathers, sons, and brothers started to weigh heavily on them. The elders, once proud of recounting battlefield victories, began to feel the sorrow of burying their own legacy. Mothers who had raised their children to be fearless regretted the day their boys walked into a battle they never returned from. Even among fierce tribes, grief was becoming more powerful than pride, and people slowly began to realize that the cycle of bloodshed was consuming their future. In this shifting emotional landscape, some tribes attempted fragile alliances, trying to reduce conflict not out of compassion but out of exhaustion. These alliances were often short-lived, collapsing at the slightest provocation. Yet they revealed that a collective desire for stability was growing. Whenever a truce was announced, markets would reopen, children would play freely again, and caravans would cautiously move across the deserts. For a brief moment, life felt peaceful. But because these truces lacked a moral foundation, they relied only on convenience. The moment a small dispute arose, the old culture of retaliation reappeared, sweeping away any hope of long-term peace. Still, each brief period of calm was a reminder of what life could be, and that memory stayed with people even during the darkest moments of war. Amidst this fragile environment, a few wise individuals emerged, travelers, traders, and spiritual seekers whose experiences beyond Arabia opened their minds to different ways of living. They had visited Yemen, Syria, Abyssinia, and Persia, where they saw organized kingdoms, established laws, and societies functioning under written codes rather than unending revenge. When they returned to Arabia, they brought stories of these systems, stories that quietly inspired curiosity among their own people. But the tribal leaders, fearing loss of power, often ignored or dismissed these ideas. To them, the traditional structure was the only system they understood. Change felt like a threat to their authority. Yet even their resistance could not stop the questions forming in the minds of the younger generation, who wondered why their lives had to revolve around wars started long before they were born. At the same time, the Arabian Peninsula's geography deepened the problem. Tribes were scattered across vast deserts, and survival itself was a challenge. Resources like water, grazing land, and trade access became reasons for conflict. A single well could become the center of a deadly feud. A caravan passing through someone's territory without permission could ignite a war. Survival and pride became indistinguishable. People didn't just fight to protect resources. They fought because their world had taught them that losing a dispute meant losing status, dignity, and the right to be taken seriously among neighboring tribes. Yet, despite all these pressures, the region's spiritual seekers, known as the Hunafa, were among the first to recognize that the endless fighting reflected something much deeper, a spiritual emptiness. They withdrew from tribal politics and began seeking a higher truth, believing that the problem was not just tribal but moral. They observed that idols could not bring justice, that customs had failed to prevent suffering, and that the people lived without a unifying purpose. Their search for meaning was a silent protest against the system that had trapped Arabia for centuries. Though they were few, their presence hinted that Arabia was slowly preparing for a transformation far greater than anyone could imagine. This underlying shift, tired hearts, exhausted warriors, curious youth, wise travelers, and spiritual seekers, created an invisible tension in the air. It felt as if Arabia was standing at the edge of something enormous. The old ways were still powerful, but cracks were beginning to appear. The society was wounded, unstable, and divided, yet also unknowingly ready for a message that could break the tribal chains and reshape the future. This silent readiness, this unseen longing for change became the soil in which the coming revolution would take root, waiting only for a leader who could finally rewrite the story of Arabia. How tribal poets fueled or stopped wars. As the tribal feuds dragged on, war slowly became more than just a reaction to insult. It evolved into a culture, shaping identities, poetry, leadership, and the very psychology of Arabian life. Young boys grew up listening to heroic tales of warriors who avenged their tribes with unmatched bravery, and these stories were recited with pride around campfires. Poets, the media of that time, would immortalize battles through verses that spread across the desert like wildfire. A single poet could ignite a war by insulting an opposing tribe, or prevent one by praising their honor. Words carried weight equal to swords, and sometimes even greater. The tribe whose poet had the strongest tongue often held more influence than the tribe with the strongest army. Through poetry, pride was fueled, grievances were remembered, and victories were celebrated, ensuring that the memory of every conflict lived on across generations. Within this environment, tribal leaders faced immense pressure. They were expected to protect the honor of their people at any cost. If they showed restraint or avoided retaliation, they were considered weak, even if their intentions were peaceful. A chief who refused to take revenge risked losing loyalty, authority, and respect. So leadership itself became a burden. Every decision had to balance pride, safety, and survival. One wrong move could throw the entire tribe into a decades-long war. Even leaders who wanted peace felt chained by tradition, forced to uphold customs that only deepened the wounds of society. They knew the cycle was wrong, but breaking it seemed impossible without risking everything they had built. Trade routes also suffered under this unstable world. Caravans traveled through lands riddled with tension, where any tribe could block a passage or demand heavy compensation just to allow movement. Wealth became unpredictable. One season prosperous, the next destroyed by conflict. The merchants and traders who relied on stability to thrive became some of the most vocal critics of endless feuds. Their livelihood depended on safe roads, fair negotiations, and peaceful relations, and yet they found themselves constantly at risk. Raiders frequently attacked caravans under the banner of honor or revenge, even if the true motive was economic gain. Over time, this instability pushed traders to seek safer alternatives outside Arabia, further weakening local economies and exposing the region's deep vulnerability. As the years passed, the social cost of war grew heavier. Weddings became moments of fear rather than celebration, funerals became communal routines, and families lived in constant anticipation of the next attack. Women, who were the emotional center of the tribe, carried the grief of losing multiple generations of men. They were often the silent witnesses of a society tearing itself apart, knowing that the death of one relative today would almost certainly cause the death of another tomorrow. Some mothers prayed their sons would not grow into warriors, not because they lacked pride, but because they knew the reality of war too intimately, the emptiness it left behind, the endless sorrow it created. Even the environment reflected the strain. The desert itself became scarred with abandoned battlefields, the remains of ancient conflicts scattered across regions like silent reminders of human stubbornness. Every tribe had a place where they had lost brothers, a valley that echoed with the stories of bloodshed, or a dune that held the memory of a warrior who died too young. These places became symbols of pride and pain, shaping the emotional map of Arabia. They served as constant reminders that the past was never truly past. It lived on through stories, grudges, and expectations. And yet, through all this destruction, there remained a strange sense of unity. The tribes, despite their conflicts, shared a common language, culture, and code of honor. They understood each other deeply, even when they disagreed violently. Their traditions were similar, their values intertwined, and their way of life connected by centuries of shared history. It was as if the land was divided on the surface but bound together underneath, waiting for a force powerful enough to transform their scattered loyalties into a single unified purpose. This hidden unity, fragile yet undeniable, would later become the foundation upon which a remarkable transformation was built, a transformation that would not erase their history, but finally give it direction and meaning. The turning point before Islam. In the heart of this turbulent era, one truth began to rise above all others. Arabia's greatest enemy was not any specific tribe or leader. It was the invisible chain of revenge that bound them all. Even the fiercest warriors, those celebrated in poetry and honored by their people, began to realize that no matter how many enemies they defeated, the war never truly ended. Every act of vengeance created another. Every slain warrior left behind a brother or cousin ready to take up arms. And every tribe, no matter how victorious in battle, carried the same scars. As generations passed, these scars became deeper than any physical wound, embedding themselves into the psychology of the people. They began to see that violence had not protected their honor, it had consumed it. It was during this time that a small but powerful idea began to spread, quietly, hesitantly, almost fearfully. The idea that perhaps the cycle of revenge was not destiny, that perhaps honor could be redefined. Travelers returning from Syria and Yemen brought stories of courts, judges, written laws, and systems that offered justice without bloodshed. These stories were almost unbelievable to many Arabs, who had lived their entire lives believing that justice could only be delivered through personal retaliation. But to a few thinkers and spiritual seekers, these tales ignited a spark of hope. They wondered whether a society could exist where disputes were resolved without lifelong grudges, where children did not inherit wars, and where life was more valuable than pride. Yet the idea was fragile. The old ways were powerful, rooted in centuries of custom. Anyone who suggested abandoning revenge risked being labeled a coward or a traitor to their tribe. The culture was built upon the belief that bravery was measured by one's willingness to fight, not to forgive. Forgiveness was considered weakness, and weakness invited attack. So even those who longed for peace often had no choice but to uphold the traditions of war, knowing that refusing to retaliate could bring more danger to their people. This created a painful contradiction within the hearts of many, a longing for peace trapped inside a system built for conflict. At the same time, a deeper spiritual hunger began to emerge. The idols that once served as symbols of protection and identity no longer felt sufficient. People sought meaning beyond tribal loyalty, beyond tradition, beyond the endless cycle of survival and revenge. They sensed that something was missing, something that could not be found in war stories or prideful victories. The poets, once celebrated for igniting battles, began composing verses that questioned existence itself, speaking about fate, death, purpose, and the fragility of human life. Their words hinted at an awakening, a subtle awareness that the old world was preparing to break. Across the desert, the respected elders noticed the shift. They could feel the tension between tradition and change, between pride and exhaustion. Some resisted it fiercely, fearing the loss of their authority. Others embraced it quietly, hoping for a future where their grandchildren would not grow up in the shadow of war. But none of them could predict what was coming. A transformation so profound that it would reshape not just Arabia, but the destiny of the world. And in the middle of all this, the tribe of Quraysh, guardians of the Kaaba, stood at a crossroads. They held immense influence over trade, culture, and spiritual rituals, yet even they were not immune to the instability around them. Their strength came from unity, but unity itself was fragile in a land built on rivalry. As tensions grew, even the Quraysh began to feel the weight of a world on the edge of collapse. They sensed that the desert, silent and ancient, was waiting for a new voice. A voice strong enough to challenge centuries of bloodshed, to redefine honor, to unify tribes, and to heal the wounds carved deep into the soul of Arabia. The stage was set. The people were weary. The struggles of generations had prepared the land for something, someone, who would bring not just peace, but purpose. A message that would finally give meaning to their suffering and guide them toward a future far greater than the world they had known. But at this moment in history, no one could see the full picture. All they felt was an unspoken anticipation, a quiet tremor beneath the surface of society, a sense that Arabia was standing on the threshold of an extraordinary dawn. He was not born a king, nor a prophet, nor a general. He was born a poet, and in a world where words could kill or save, that alone made him dangerous and powerful. Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma moved through the desert like someone who had learned to listen to the land. He heard its whispers, its grudges, and its regrets, and he translated them into verses that carried the weight of history. In a society where every man's worth was measured by his courage in battle, Zuhair's courage was different. He risked reputation and retribution by choosing wisdom over applause, counsel over vengeance. He had the rare talent to speak plainly to proud men and to make truth sound like honor. This was a perilous gift in Jahiliyyah, because the same tongue that could glorify a tribe could just as easily humiliate it, and humiliation in that world required redress. Yet Zuhair used his craft not to inflame but to remind. He remembered names, losses, deserts, and wells, and he folded them into lines that refused easy triumphalism. He understood that a poem could be a sword, yes, but it could also be a bridge. Imagine him at the seasonal market of Epochs, the great forum of pre-Islamic Arabia where tribes gathered to trade, to compete, and above all to recite. The air thrummed with anticipation. Merchants bartering spices, camels chewing quietly, women trading gossip, and men sharpening their reputations with stories. Into this charged arena a poet stepped, and when Zuhair opened his mouth, the world slowed. He did not shout. He measured every pause. His verses struck like flint against stone, igniting thought rather than fury. In his stanzas were images of wounded mothers, of sons buried before their time, of wells left untended because their guardians died in a senseless raid. He did not flatter power. He challenged it gently, offering an alternative form of nobility. Restraint, justice, the courage to forgive. Men who had come expecting entertainment found themselves confronted with conscience. Zuhair's role cannot be separated from the context that made poets into public arbiters. In a land without courts, poets were the news anchors, the historians, the opinion makers. Their words shaped memory. When a poet praised a victory, he canonized it. When he mocked a leader, he stripped that man's glory away. Zuhair used this cultural mechanism with the precision of a surgeon. He praised bravery, but he refused to celebrate brutality. He lauded sacrifices, but he insisted that sacrifice should have purpose, not the hollow vanity of honor for its own sake. This was radical because it questioned the very currency the tribes traded in. His lines asked a simple, dangerous question: what good is honor if it produces only sorrow? By reframing honor as responsibility rather than retaliation, Zuhair planted a seed that would later find fertile ground when a new moral system arrived. There were moments when Zuhair's poetry directly intervened in conflict. When a feud threatened to engulf entire regions, tribal leaders, men hardened by years of battle, sometimes invited him to recite not as entertainment, but as a test. Could words cool a wound that steel had opened? Zuhair accepted these invitations with an artist's humility and a statesman's nerve. He would stand before chieftains and, instead of delivering stinging satire, recite pieces that catalogued loss and asked for repair. He made the cost of revenge visible, the names of mothers who would outlive their sons, the droughts that would follow when fields were abandoned, the caravans that would never arrive when roads ran with blood. His poetry was narrative empathy. It forced listeners to imagine the faces on the other side of their anger. When men heard their pain mirrored in Zuhair's lines, some of them found the courage to lay down their arms. That influence did not come without opposition. Other poets, invested in maintaining the honor economy, attacked him with ridicule and scorn. They accused him of cowardice or betrayal, of siding with weakness. In public gatherings, the back and forth of poetic duels could escalate into threats, and Zuhair took his share of risk. He knew that to use verse as a plea for peace was to stand against a culture of retribution. Yet his standing was such that even his critics listened. Tribes respected him not because he avoided offense entirely, but because he had the moral authority to offend the patterns of thinking that enslaved them. He did not preach from a place of theory. His poems were steeped in lived knowledge, names, dates, bloodlines, evidence that he had wrestled with the consequences of war up close. Beyond the public stage, Zuhair's life reflected the ambivalence of his age. He was a man who loved his people's customs even as he mourned their cost. He ate the same bread as warriors, frequented the same tents, and understood the logic of dignity that drove men to fight. This was crucial. His critiques were not foreign impositions but internal admonitions. He spoke as one of them, and that authenticity made his words bite deeper. When he called for peace, it was not an abandonment of identity, but an appeal to a higher identity, mercy, reflection, and the courage to choose the future over an inherited grudges. This kind of appeal resonates because it is not about negating tradition. It is about elevating it. His craftsmanship as a poet also matters. Zuhair's lines were built on memory and rhythm, on images that lodged in the imagination. He drew on everyday scenes: the caravans under a blood-red sky, the faces of mothers at gravesides, the silence that follows a night of plunder, and turned them into motifs that listeners could not forget. He knew how to make a single couplet stand for an entire saga. In an oral culture, this is the difference between a passing remark and a social turning point. His poems were recited long after the battles had been fought, and each recitation was a tiny act of education, reminding new generations why certain feuds had begun and whether they were worth continuing. Perhaps the most significant legacy of Zuhair is not the specific peace deals he helped broker, though they mattered, but the intellectual precedent he set. He proved that poetry could be more than a weapon. It could be corrective. He demonstrated that moral leadership need not always be violent or loud. It could be persuasive and patient. By making compassion rhetorically respectable, Zuhair softened the culture's language of honor and broadened the vocabulary of dignity to include restraint. This subtle shift, a poet reimagining what honor could mean, helped create a conceptual space in which larger transformations could occur. When a new message of unity and justice later entered Arabia, people already had examples of public discourse that valued mercy over mere retaliation. In the end, Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma reminds us that cultural change rarely arrives in a single thunderbolt. It creeps, it mutters, and it is shaped by people who refuse simple binaries. He stands as a figure who refused to accept the inevitability of violence simply, because it had always been so, who used the very instrument that supported the war culture, poetry, to subvert it. His life teaches that influence can be quiet and persistent, that words are not powerless in the face of swords, and that sometimes the bravest act is to make peace sound like honor. In a world of blood feud and endless remembrance, Zuhair carved out lines that made future generations imagine a different way to keep their dignity, and for that reason his voice remains a beacon in the otherwise thunderous silence of pre-Islamic Arabia. The story of Arabia's tribal wars is not just a tale of battles and revenge. It is a mirror reflecting the nature of human beings when left without guidance, structure, or moral foundation. When we look closely at this era, we discover lessons far greater than the events themselves, lessons that reach across centuries and remain relevant to every society, every leader, and every individual alive today. The first lesson becomes clear the moment we understand how easily honor can transform into destruction when it is guided by pride instead of wisdom. The Arabs of Jahiliyyah valued honor more than life itself, but their definition of honor had become distorted over generations. What began as a noble desire to protect dignity turned into a cycle of vengeance that trapped the entire society. Their world teaches us that honor, when detached from morality, becomes a weapon that harms the very people it claims to protect. True honor is not in retaliating instantly. It is in knowing when to respond with justice, when to forgive, and when to rise above emotion to protect a greater good. Another powerful lesson emerges when we observe how a society without a central system of justice collapses into chaos. Every tribe acted as its own judge, jury, and executioner. Justice varied from tribe to tribe depending on emotion, power, or circumstance. This inconsistency created a world where no one felt secure. Even the innocent could become targets of revenge simply because they belonged to the wrong family. This teaches us that law and order are among the greatest blessings a community can have. Without them, even courageous people become fearful, and even good people are forced into violence. Stability is not just built through armies or wealth. It is built through fair justice that protects all people equally, not just those with influence. A third lesson shines through the emotional toll these wars placed on families. The endless cycle of conflict left behind widows, orphaned children, and broken households. Generations grew up with trauma, carrying the weight of wars started long before their birth. This reminds us that violence is never limited to the battlefield. It enters homes, hearts, and memories. The emotional scars of conflict last far longer than the battles themselves. Every choice we make, whether driven by anger, ego, or impulse, affects more than just us. It shapes the lives of people we may never meet and leaves a legacy that can either heal or destroy. The people of Arabia learned this the hard way, and their suffering stands as a reminder of the importance of seeking peace before conflict and wisdom before reaction. The story also reveals how dangerous it is when culture becomes trapped in tradition without questioning whether those traditions still serve the good of society. For centuries, Arabs followed customs simply because they inherited them. Revenge was a tradition. Warfare was a tradition. Generational hatred was a tradition. But no one stopped to ask if these traditions were helping or harming them. The truth is that not every tradition deserves loyalty. Some must be reformed, some abandoned, and some replaced with principles that uplift humanity rather than imprison it. The ability to question the past and rise above it is what allows societies to grow. Without that ability, people become prisoners of their own history. A deeper lesson lies in the quiet shift that took place in the hearts of the people, a longing for stability, justice, and meaning. This longing teaches us that human beings, no matter how lost or divided, possess an inner voice that recognizes truth when they see it. The Arabs of Jahiliyyah were surrounded by idols, war, and lawlessness, yet many of them began seeking something higher. They looked for a system that could unify them, a principle that could end their suffering, a truth that could give purpose to their lives. Their world reminds us that even in the darkest environments, the human soul is capable of yearning for light. It tells us that people change not when forced, but when exhausted enough to see the need for transformation. A striking lesson also appears in the way poetry shaped their society. Words had the power to start wars or prevent them. A single verse could influence thousands. This teaches us how powerful communication truly is. Words are not empty. They carry energy, direction, and consequences. They can heal or harm, inspire or ignite conflict. In our world today, where communication travels faster than ever, the lesson becomes even more urgent. A single message, rumor, or statement can shape opinions, fuel hatred, or spread hope across entire nations. The responsibility of speech is immense, and the pre-Islamic poets remind us that with influence comes accountability. Another subtle but profound lesson is found in the unity beneath their division. The tribes shared a common language, culture, ancestry, and values, yet they fought as if they were completely unrelated. Their story teaches us that people often focus on their differences and forget their similarities. Division becomes easier because it requires no effort. Unity requires humility, patience, and leadership. The Arabs were not incapable of unity. They simply lacked someone to guide them toward it. This shows us that societies need leaders who can rise above tribalism and personal interest. Leaders who can see beyond conflict and imagine a greater purpose for their people. Leadership is not about power. It is about vision. Finally, perhaps the most important lesson of all is that chaos often prepares the way for transformation. The suffering of Arabia was not meaningless. It softened hearts, exposed the failures of their system, and made people ready for a message that could lift them out of darkness. Sometimes societies must hit the limits of their own destruction before they recognize the need for change. Sometimes pain becomes the bridge to enlightenment. The tribal wars did not just destroy, they also awakened, humbled, and prepared. They created a generation that was finally ready to receive guidance, ready to embrace unity, and ready to follow a leader who would show them a path greater than tribal pride. And when the time came, that leader emerged, not as a warrior seeking revenge, not as a chief seeking authority, but as a messenger carrying a truth that would heal their wounds and reshape their destiny forever. As the sun sets over the endless dunes of Arabia, the echoes of tribal wars fade into the quiet hum of the desert wind. The blood feuds that once shaped every valley, every well, and every tent have left their mark on the land and its people, but the story is far from over. What we have witnessed in this chapter is more than just conflict. It is the shaping of a society in its most raw and unrefined form, a society that yearns for guidance, that seeks meaning beyond survival, and that carries within it the seeds of transformation. The lessons are clear. Honor without wisdom destroys. Vengeance without justice enslaves. And the courage to speak truth, even in a world consumed by pride, can quietly alter the course of history. As we leave this chapter behind, remember that these were not isolated incidents of violence, but the foundations upon which a remarkable change will one day rise. A change that will reshape Arabia and the world in ways unimaginable to those living through these tumultuous times. But the story does not end with observation or reflection. The desert, patient and eternal, holds more secrets, more struggles, and more lessons waiting to be uncovered. In our next episode, we will journey deeper into the heart of pre-Islamic Arabia to uncover how the very structure of these tribal wars, seemingly chaotic and senseless, created the patterns of loyalty, strategy, and survival that would later shape leaders and thinkers capable of uniting an entire people. We will explore the cunning of tribal alliances, the subtleties of negotiation and betrayal, and the extraordinary tales of individuals whose decisions, small or great, rippled across generations. You will witness how a single insult, a stolen camel, or a misjudged act of pride could ignite a conflict that consumed hundreds of lives, and how the wisdom of certain men and women occasionally interrupted the cycle, hinting at the possibility of a society guided not only by strength but by intelligence and foresight. Expect to meet new characters, some familiar, others whose names are etched less clearly in history, yet whose actions shaped the course of Arabia. From tribal leaders navigating the dangerous balance between power and respect to ordinary men and women caught in the tides of events beyond their control, their stories will reveal the intricate tapestry of life in a land on the brink of monumental change. We will also uncover how trade, religion, and migration intertwined with these conflicts, creating a world where every decision mattered, where every alliance was precarious, and where the choices of a few could alter the destiny of many. So prepare to step once more into the deserts and markets, the tents and battlefields, where honor, pride, and survival collide. The next episode promises deeper insights into the forces that molded Arabia before the light of Islam emerged, a world teetering between chaos and unity, between destruction and hope. The echoes of the past are loud, the lessons profound, and the story far from over. Join us as the journey continues, and as Arabia's story unfolds, revealing the challenges, the struggles, and the quiet anticipation of a new era waiting just beyond the horizon. The stage is set, the players are ready, and the sands of time are shifting once again.